So once again, thank you all for joining us today for the Behavioral Health and Wellness Program's presentation on this important topic of electronic nicotine delivery systems and how they are affecting the way we understand and approach nicotine dependence recovery. My name is Jim Pavlik, and I'm the Senior Program and Policy Analyst here at BHWP at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. I have a few things to share before we get into the meat of today's presentation. Today's webinar is made possible due to two sponsors who provided part of the funding for this event: the University of Colorado School of Medicine UPL grant and Colorado Amendment 35 Tobacco Education and Cessation Grant Program administered by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. That said, the views expressed today are not necessarily reflective of either the CU School of Medicine or CDPHE. For the most part, I will adhere to the scientific consensus on most matters under consideration today. That said, there are a lot of unknowns as it concerns these products, and to make a presentation that attempts to take what is known and translate it for clinical encounters, we're going to have to engage in some well-reasoned speculation. I will try to point out when I'm doing that, and when I do, you should know that those opinions, judgments, and speculations are BHWP's alone and not those of our sponsors. With all that being said, I do not have any other conflicts of interest to declare, financial or otherwise. And with those out of the way, here's what we will be discussing today. I want to provide a very brief introduction to what these products are and draw some lines around which ones I will be and won't be talking about. I also want to roughly outline two distinct audiences that have different rationales for using these products, different health concerns, and different cessation strategies: youths and adults. I want to discuss whether these devices can be used for cessation and what, if anything, can be done to maximize those beneficial effects. And finally, I want to discuss some interrelated topics that will likely show up as you engage patients in conversations about the role of ENDS in their cessation attempts. As many of you may have already noticed, we don't use the term electronic cigarettes, but rather a broader one: electronic nicotine delivery systems, abbreviated ENDS, of which electronic cigarettes are just one member. So, what are electronic nicotine delivery systems? We've adopted the definition here: a battery-powered device that provides inhaled doses of nicotine. Such devices vary in many ways, but all have three main components in common: a battery, a heating system, which includes the heating coils and the wick, and a reservoir where nicotine is held. And it's here I want to pause. We used to say that these were devices where nicotine was held in a solution, and that solution contained propylene glycol and/or glycerin. And while that is true of all the devices I'll be discussing today, there are already new products being marketed that still use a battery and a heating element to aerosolize nicotine so it can be inhaled, but they don't hold nicotine in a solution. Rather, these products, generally called heat not burn products, use some form of the actual tobacco leaf. Earlier this year, the FDA approved the marketing of a device called IQOS. The first store for IQOS opened in Atlanta in October, and earlier this month, a second store opened in Richmond, all of this preceding what will eventually be a national rollout. So if you haven't run across these devices already, you likely will pretty soon. We won't be discussing these products today, although future presentations on ENDS will likely have to do so. Instead, we're going to be talking about the products summarized on this slide. At the top left, we have our first generation electronic cigarettes. These are sometimes called cigalikes because they resemble conventional cigarettes in their general size and shape, and as in the example shown here, sometimes go so far as to resemble the appearance of a specific popular brand of conventional cigarettes. While not always the case, these products are normally intended to be single use. The batteries are not rechargeable, and the reservoir where the nicotine is stored is not refillable. Again, this is not always the case, but we would call an e-cigarette. That is generally true of them. These products are often not particularly well made, and users report that they feel flimsy. And the hit of nicotine is often reported as being, quote unquote, unsatisfying, which in many cases is simply a euphemism for not being as addictive as the nicotine hit from a cigarette, a point we will return to later. In these devices, the reservoir where the nicotine solution is held is often called a cartridge, a point that's only important because in our second generation products, these are sometimes referred to as medium tank products. The tank in this case being the name of the reservoir where the nicotine is stored. Until the introduction of the pod mods in late 2015, it was pretty common to refer to the reservoir as a cartridge if it was disposable and a tank if it was refillable. Tanks are filled or refilled with a solution called e-juice. E-juice contains free-base nicotine, some flavoring compounds, and propylene glycol and/or glycerin. The propylene glycol and/or glycerin holds the nicotine in suspension and allows it to be aerosolized and inhaled. It also adds a sweetness to the aerosol and acts as a flavor preservative, much as it does when it's added to other food products like ice cream. At any rate, these second generation products are often called vape pens or vape hookahs, although vape hookah is more common overseas. Until Juul hit the market, these products were the dominant ENDS family member on the scene. They have rechargeable batteries and refillable tanks. With very little additional effort over the first generation products, they deliver a significantly better hit. And because the tanks are refillable, the range of potential flavors a consumer can access are much greater. In fact, most ENDS manufacturers adhere to design specifications that allow users to choose components from different manufacturers for a personally tailored vape pen, both in terms of function and appearance. The fact that you can have a uniquely customized product delivering the best hit from the user's perspective are qualities that led to these devices' popularity. However, for a truly tailored product delivering the most powerful nicotine hit, a certain set of users would eventually graduate to a third generation product, what the FDA refers to as large tank products, and what were informally referred to as mods, because every aspect of the device was intended to be modifiable. While these products deliver the best nicotine hit, to truly customize these products requires some technical know-how or the wherewithal to learn it, and quite a bit of personal experimentation. And in point of fact, the level of nicotine delivery efficiency is biochemically limited due to the nature of the free-base nicotine used in the e-juice, which is to say that it requires a lot of additional effort for only a slightly better hit. As a result, the main attraction inspiring a user to graduate from the vape pens to a mod is either the hobbyist aspect, some people just like to tinker with things, or the related socializing that comes with these products. Mods have a pretty robust online community, and if you've seen people, for example, performing smoke tricks with e-vapor, they're most likely using a mod. I've been alluding to it throughout this section, but it's worth pointing out that researchers used to note a pretty specific progression. A smoker would transition to a cig-alike and, after some time, graduate to a vape pen. Most users really didn't like the feel or the hit or the flavors of the cig-alikes, and many would relapse back to smoking, but some would persevere, leading to most end users using vape pens. And a few of those would progress to mods, leading us to a situation where, when we referred to e-cigarettes up to 2015, what we really meant were vape pens. But then 2015 happened, and Juul hit the market, and within a year they had gobbled up about 70% of the ENDS market share, which, in addition to being generally frightening for reasons we will discuss shortly, also upsets our understanding of what's really going on and what the consequences are likely to be. The fact is that while these products are clearly an ENDS product and have been included in ENDS research for a little bit, they are significantly different in many critical ways. Before going into more detail, I want to mention 2 points about terminology, just so that we can all stay on the same page. These products, until last fall, were often called pod-based products. Suddenly, and with no good explanation that I found, they started being referred to as pod mods, a term I've adopted just so that when you read about them in the paper, you will know what they are. The explanation I've seen is that they use a pod, but that was also true in 2015, 2016, 2017, and 2018, when they were referred to as pod-based rather than pod mods. So these are the models that use pods. I don't like it because it confuses these products with the third generation mods, and it implies a level of modifiability that pod mods don't really share with their highly modifiable predecessors. Also, this notion of a pod is weird too. The reservoir where the nicotine is stored, Juul Labs, calls that thing a pod. And by their design, it's not intended to be refilled, although you can watch an endless stream of videos online on how to take them apart and refill them. Some of Juul's competitors make their reservoirs refillable by design, which means that it would be just as accurate to stick to our old naming convention and call the disposable ones cartridges and the refillable ones tanks. In reality, the most popular usage in the user community is to refer to the pods as carts, short for cartridges, regardless if they are designed as refillable or not, and also making the use of the term pod mods superfluous. I, however, will continue using pod mods for the reasons that I stated. So what are these products? One quick note, pictured here and on the previous slide is a Juul device. All the scientific comments I make about pod mods should apply to Juul and also its competitors. However, Juul was the first of these products, and they're still by far the most popular of these products. And to the extent that research has been conducted on pod mods, they have, for the reasons I've already mentioned, been almost exclusively done on Juul. For my part, I will try to stick to the generic term, but when I'm talking about Juul specifically, I will say it. So in terms of what are they? In short, these products are electronic nicotine delivery systems as defined on the first slide of this section. They have a rechargeable battery, in this case recharged via USB port, and they have a heating element that aerosolizes nicotine from a solution so it can be inhaled. And they have a cartridge, tank, or pod where the nicotine is stored. When you read articles, especially the breathless ones from late 2016 and early 2017, the main takeaway seemed to be that what made these products unique was its sleek design and the manufacturer's guerrilla marketing campaign that was launched nearly exclusively through Twitter and Instagram, a decision that, intentionally or not, seems to be the reason that it began spreading through high schools and middle schools like a viral epidemic. But the real reason these devices are unique and why we should treat them differently than what came before is because of the final two bullets on this slide. The high concentration of nicotine in the pod and the new nicotine formulation it uses, the nicotine salt formulation. This nicotine salt formulation performs much better than the free-base nicotine in the previous generations of ends. In fact, according to Juul themselves, it delivers more nicotine than an e-cigarette, about as much nicotine as an actual cigarette, conventional cigarette, and about the same speed as a cigarette. This is important because while nicotine itself is a highly addictive stimulant, the most addictive delivery device ever devised is the cigarette. And according to Juul themselves, their device outperforms cigarettes. There's some reason to be skeptical of this claim, and of course, Juul doesn't say their device is, quote, more addictive than cigarettes. Rather, what they say is that the hit off a Juul is just as satisfying as the one off a cigarette. And thus, smokers who transition to Juul are less likely to relapse to smoking, according to Juul. Still, if we take Juul at their word here, the patent they filed for their device amounts to a declaration of a competitively addictive product. So those are the products we're talking about, and the question before us today is this: are those products good cessation devices? Well, to understand that answer when we get there, we need to know a little bit about who uses these products and why. Current use trends may provide useful context to the success or failures of these devices for cessation. So one thing to point out is that for now, despite the uncountable number of headlines we've read on these devices, and despite the sensationalized nature of a lot of those headlines, they actually aren't being used by that many people. Only about 3% of adults use ends, and less than half of them use every day. By contrast, about 20% of adults use any tobacco product, and about 15% or so smoke cigarettes specifically, which is to say that about 80% of all tobacco use is cigarettes alone. The continued prominence of cigarettes remains important even as we shift the conversation to the electronic versions, because, as we'll see in just a moment, most ends users actually dual use ends along with conventional cigarettes. And relapse or progression to cigarettes is an extremely common path for ends users. While only 3% of adults use ends, when we narrow down to just young adults, those that are aged 18 to 24, the rate basically doubles. This is indicative of a growing attractiveness among those who don't have established tobacco habits. And in fact, as we go down in age, the attractiveness goes up even higher, with nearly 21% of high schoolers having used an ends product in the last 30 days. By contrast, a few years ago, only 8% of high schoolers were using any tobacco product at all. As we move toward our clinical recommendations, we should also take a look at why those who use ends say they use them. The first thing to note is that youth use these products not primarily as cessation aids, and that makes sense because they weren't smokers beforehand. And they're not primarily being used as a supplement to a smoking habit. not in fact primarily for health in general, but rather for its social cachet. It's a thing the cool kids do. This really separates it from smoking, which is a highly stigmatized behavior in high schools. And this is important when we consider our cessation planning later. If kids primarily use for social reasons, then planning and preparing for this hit to their social life must be taken into consideration. And even if we could provide kids with pharmacotherapy, we have to understand that medicine does not address life on Instagram. It doesn't address fear of missing out and other aspects of teens' highly networked life and the role that vaping plays in it. By contrast, the dominant reasons that adults use ends is to help them cut back or quit smoking. And when I say dominant, I mean that that reason is at the top by a pretty large margin. Of the 2% of callers to the Colorado Quit Line that reported using ends products, 72% of them said they did so to cut back or quit smoking, and 92% of them said they reported they also wanted to continue on toward nicotine abstinence as well. So I want to explore one more aspect of younger users of ends versus older ones, and that is their continued use of conventional tobacco products. Here we see the subset of all adults that are aged 18 to 24. And here we see that 43% of current ends users in this age bracket still use conventional tobacco products. The other 57% use ends exclusively. And of those that use ends exclusively, 3/4 of them never smoked at all before. Compare that to the entire adult population. And here we see that nearly 2/3 of ends users are dual using. And of the 41% that use ends exclusively, only 1/4 of them were never smokers before picking up their ends habit. In early 2017, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine released a comprehensive report on the scientific research into ends. In their summary of the overall public health benefits, they stated that for adult smokers, ends represented a clear harm reduction benefit. And I want to reiterate that and make an explicit point about it. Cigarettes kill nearly 500,000 people a year. Cigarettes will kill between 1/3 and 1/2 of every person that smokes regularly. So to say that ends are safer than cigarettes should be an uncontroversial conclusion, so long as we understand the limits of what safer in this context means. Safer does not mean safe. We will discuss some of the known dangers of ends shortly. For adults who do not currently have a tobacco habit, adding ends is a net loss to their health. For children and young adults for whom nicotine itself is dangerous, the calculus for determining harm reduction is significantly altered. And to the extent that ends are attracted to youth and pulling in more future nicotine-dependent individuals than cigarettes have, ends represents a public health reversal to young people. And since nicotine can be transferred to the fetus and to nursing infants, the public health calculus for pregnant and nursing mothers is also fraught, which is all to say that within the narrow scope of non-pregnant, non-nursing, nicotine-dependent adults with a conventional tobacco habit, ends represents a public health win if, I want to pause on that if they transition entirely to ends. So with all that in mind, what does this chart tell us? Well, it tells us that for 11% of ends users, they have chosen ends rather than the clearly better path of no nicotine habit at all. However, we don't know how many of those 11% would have stayed nicotine-free and how many would have adopted a conventional tobacco habit. History tells us that number would be pretty low. Nearly all cigarette smokers develop their daily habit before the age of 18. For 30% of ends users, there's a mitigated win. As long as they maintain an ends exclusive habit, the former smokers have accessed a less harmful one, according to the National Academies, a stance also accepted by the CDC. But do they maintain this ends exclusivity? And finally, we see that the vast majority of adults are seeing no harm reduction benefit at all. That's right. In the technical language of tobacco researchers, they say the harms from cigarettes saturate early. The way I like to discuss it is to ask people to think of a shot to the heart. The first bullet is doing a significant amount of damage. Certainly 2 bullets is worse than 1, but since the first one is likely to be fatal anyway, the additional harm of the second bullet isn't as dramatic as the damage done by the first. And similarly, the difference in damage between the second and third is not as important as the difference between the first and second, and on and on. And that's how cigarettes work as well. Another way to think about it is via poison. If a teaspoon of poison is enough to be fatal, then it really doesn't matter if you drink 2, 3 or 4 teaspoons, or a cup of it. If exposure to the quantity of toxins in one daily cigarette is enough to cause heart disease, it doesn't really matter if you have 2, 3, or 20. And that is, in fact, the case with cigarettes. Just one cigarette a day significantly increases an individual's risk of developing heart disease and lung cancer, the two diseases which together amount to about 80% of all cigarette-related deaths. So for those 59% of individuals dual using, it's doubtful their risk of early morbidity and mortality has been reduced at all. This is where we used to have to leave this chart. However, thanks to a new longitudinal cohort study called the Population Assessment and Tobacco Health Study, or PATH, we now have an idea of what the people in this pie chart are doing a year later. One thing to note is that about 15% of individuals using ENDS dually or exclusively in wave 1 of the PATH study had become nicotine-free a year later. That number puts ENDS somewhere in the ballpark of nicotine replacement therapy, maybe a little lower. However, about half of the dual users were still dual using, and the other half had transitioned entirely to cigarettes. And they were joined by some former smokers who relapsed to cigarettes, and also by some never smokers who transitioned to a cigarette-only habit. In all, about 30% of ENDS users had transitioned to a cigarette-only habit after a year, which is to say that ENDS users are twice as likely to have transitioned to cigarettes as they were to achieve abstinence. I also want to note that all this data is pre-mod pod. So it's at least hypothetically possible that dual use is down and relapse or transition to cigarettes less likely with these more quote unquote satisfying products on the market, but we don't know that yet, or what the cost of that might be. So within the context just presented, what do we know about ENDS as cessation devices? The short version is research is mixed. In some studies, ENDS outperform nicotine replacement therapy, or NRT. In others, they overperform it. In most, the performances are roughly equal, which is what you might expect if you thought that the primary means by which NRT works is that it provides a controlled and paced quantity of the substance that powers the dependence, nicotine, because this is precisely what ENDS provide as well. However, there is reason to suspect that while ENDS may be at least as good as NRT in getting people to quit smoking when it's used in that way, perhaps it isn't quite as good at getting folks to quit nicotine. After all, NRT is specifically designed to not be addictive. Cigarettes have about a 30% capture rate. That is about 30% of individuals who use recreationally will go on to develop a problematic habit. That is, they're captured by the addictive elements of the drug. NRT by design has about a 3% capture rate, a rate that's low enough not to cause a public health concern of its own, but high enough that it will address nicotine cravings in enough people to be an adequate cessation aid. By contrast, ENDS are designed to be used recreationally. The manufacturers want their devices to be enjoyable, that is, satisfying, which might indicate a higher capture rate than NRT. In the most recent of only 3 randomized controlled trials pitting ENDS against NRT, this is precisely what they found. And I'm focusing on this one, not just because it tells the tale I think matters here, but because when this one was published in January of this year, it made a lot of headlines. And I suppose some folks who are present on the call today are familiar with those headlines. And those headlines read, ENDS are twice as good as NRT for cessation. And we can see that this is true enough. Of the roughly 400 folks who used a vape pen, 18% of them were smoke-free after a year, while only 10% of NRT users were. However, if you dig a little deeper beyond the headline, what you see is that less than 4% of vape pen users were nicotine-free after a year, while 9% of the NRT arm were. Said another way, 16 of the 72 people who used ENDS to quit smoking had gone on to become nicotine-free, while 40 out of 44 nicotine replacement therapy users had made that transition. This is an extraordinary difference and an important one if it's true that 92% of ENDS users would prefer to become nicotine-free and not just replace one addiction with another. I've already mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. If the patent from Juul is true and nicotine salts are just as or more potent, more addictive than cigarettes, then what you saw on the last slide may be worse from a nicotine abstinence perspective. That is, we may see even fewer people move from ENDS and eventually achieve nicotine abstinence. And while there's some reason to doubt that Juul is more addictive than cigarettes, there's a lot of reasons to think that they are fairly close in terms of their addictiveness. And while we can't comment on that per se yet, it's worth being on the lookout for once those studies start to get published. So I want to briefly talk about the clinical posture the clinician should adopt if he or she wishes to guide a person to nicotine abstinence, regardless if that person wants to use ENDS or has already started using them. Motivational interviewing is one of two therapeutic modalities with a strong evidence base to support its use for nicotine recovery. At the core of MI are strategies designed and practiced to enhance the rapport between the patient and the provider. When MDs often hear things like listening to the patient or developing rapport, I think there's an assumption that this is something that has to take a real long time, or at least more time than the physician generally has to offer. However, building a therapeutic rapport mostly means just thinking of yourself as a partner, collaborator, and guide rather than a leader or teacher. When it comes to tobacco, everyone knows it's bad for them. They know that they should quit. What they lack are the skills and strategies to successfully do so. And helping a patient figure out how to quit that works for them begins with understanding how they use and why, and developing a quit strategy that is responsive to those needs. So rather than using words like compassion and evocation, I've written the heart set in simpler, more actionable language. And you'll notice that listen appears on both slides. While it is true that patients more or less uniformly know that smoking is bad for them, people's knowledge about ENDS is far more variable. Many think that ENDS are much, much worse than cigarettes, which is almost certainly not true. And others think that ENDS are perfectly harmless, perhaps even healthy, and that's not true either. As we will discuss in the next and final section, part of our job is to correct misunderstandings regarding ENDS when we hear them so that our patients can make decisions for themselves as responsible adults. But first, we have to hear them. One of the things to note on this slide is the second bullet. Behavior change is hard, and feeling like we can do it is a powerful factor in determining whether we can do it. We want to make sure to take every opportunity to congratulate our patients on any success. And we have to keep in mind that the vast majority of adults using ENDS or considering them are doing so to step down or quit cigarettes. So this is a good opportunity to congratulate them on taking care of themselves and moving in the right direction while encouraging them to keep moving toward abstinence. I included this slide for those of you who are already familiar with the clinical recommendations for tobacco use. I want to show that for ENDS, they're the same, although we rewrote them and reordered them slightly just to give more priority to the counseling aspects. And on that note, I want to make one quick but important point. When we say tobacco cessation counseling, a lot of physicians hear the word therapy. Tobacco cessation counseling is not therapy. What we mean by counseling is education on the harms of use, education on the benefits of quitting, identification of triggers and barriers, and to the greatest extent possible, assisting them in overcoming those triggers and barriers. And finally, a pharmacotherapy recommendation or prescription, and if necessary, a referral to additional counseling. In this final section, I want to introduce several common misbeliefs about ENDS that will likely show up in a conversation about them. Many of them have grains of truth, but may unduly pull patients to one extreme or the other in terms of their risk assessment. What follows are not scripts per se, but the knowledge you can convey about these topics in the way that best fits your own style and the patient's needs. The first several of these are responses to headlines that received a lot of attention and may need some desensationalizing. The last few go the other way, introducing the known risks of ENDS that are often overlooked, unknown, or deliberately hidden. So the batteries in these devices have been known to explode. However, this risk has largely been addressed through manufacturing improvements and safety supplementals like automatic shutoffs. Users concerned about this should be instructed to look for safety features and to carry their devices in a way that prevents damage. A few years ago, there was an outbreak of bronchiolitis obliterans at a microwave popcorn factory. After their investigation, the CDC's best guess, although inconclusive, was that diacetyl was the likely culprit. Diacetyl is a flavor compound that provides a buttery flavor, and it has been found in some ENDS products, primarily as an ingredient in the flavors. In recent years, flavor manufacturers have been moving away from this ingredient, although it is still found in some of them. However, it should be noted that even when its existence was far more common than it is now, the average cigarette contained 8,000 times more diacetyl than the worst ends that had been tested at that time. That doesn't mean these products are safe or that diacetyl isn't a concern. Rather, it means that anybody avoiding transitioning from cigarettes to ends or is thinking of relapsing back to cigarettes in order to avoid diacetyl exposure should know that cigarettes are worse and that to achieve the level of safety desired, they should move onward toward abstinence. Nicotine overdose is another headline from a few years ago when this problem peaked. And at its peak, it seemed pretty dire, with over 200 children per month going to the ED suffering from nicotine exposure. The big culprit here seems to be the flavored e-juices, which are attractive to toddlers because of their scent and taste, who would then drink the liquid. And the fact that we have largely moved away from refillable tanks to pods is largely credited with why 2015 was the peak year. Pods came out later that year and really took off across 2016. So once again, users should know about this risk and be instructed to keep their e-juice away from small hands. This is still true for pods, especially those that are refillable, in which case the user may have tanks of e-juice or vials of e-juice around. Lipoid pneumonia is what the CDC is calling EVALI, also known as the mysterious vaping lung disease. The short version of this is that in the very vast majority of cases, the user either used THC alone or used their devices to vape both THC and nicotine. In a pretty small minority of cases, the patients reported only using nicotine, but there is some reason to doubt this, as when drug tests were performed, some of those reporting nicotine exclusive use also tested positive for THC. It was this discrepancy that acted as the impetus for the CDC's caution in naming a culprit in this in their investigation. But as more and more evidence has come in, it's become more and more convincing that the culprit at stake is vitamin E acetate, an additive to THC e-juice that dilutes it. So the CDC has advised that end users avoid vaping if possible, especially avoid THC. And if a user is incapable of making that particular decision for themselves, then at least get their materials from licensed, reputable, known sources. In almost every state, or in every state that has released a state level report on where consumers are buying the contaminated vials, they report quote unquote informal sources, which is to say online, through family and friends, and also from just straight up drug dealers. So BHWP has added to that recommendation to also use the devices per the manufacturer's instructions. We've already mentioned that Juul doesn't have refillable cartridges, and so people should not be having those cartridges refilled and used. Once you start refilling, you expose yourself to have adulterated refillable products. Formaldehyde is a known carcinogen in both cigarette smoke and ENDS vapor. In fact, California launched a lawsuit against Juul for levels of formaldehyde that exceed the state's rigid standards. But once again, this toxin is found in both products and in smaller quantities in the electronic versions. So, like with diacetyl, we don't want people avoiding or abandoning these products due to formaldehyde exposure risk. Rather, we want them to just move toward abstinence. You will hear, especially from the retailers and user community, that these products are FDA approved, or the e-juice is generally safe. And this is not entirely true either. Rather, the main ingredients of concern in the e-juice, the propylene glycol, the glycerin, and the flavorings, have a designation of GRAS, generally recognized as safe. This is a pretty low bar from the FDA, and it means that these products are, well, generally recognized as safe as consumed food products. That is, they're eaten or drunk. There have been no tests on whether these are safe when heated and inhaled. We also know that at least in the short term, glycol has been shown to be an eye and lung irritant. Some of the flavorings have been shown in the lab to kill cells. And glycol was suspected in at least one early case of lipoid pneumonia. Now, this was never proven, and none of the cases from this latest epidemic have been caused by it. But it's still noteworthy that it has the properties that might lead to that outcome. Many believe, and this seems to be a deliberate misleading, that what is inhaled is nothing but water vapor or harmless water vapor. And this is patently untrue. There are a lot of things in the inhaled aerosol, including solid particulate matter of the PM2.5 size, associated with the development of several lung and heart conditions, as well as heavy metals like nickel, cadmium, and lead. Many individuals are using these as cessation devices, and as we've discussed, some will be successful by this method. However, relapse is twice as likely a result here. The best cessation devices are the 7 FDA-approved pharmacotherapies, including the 5 NRTs. Similarly, many want to use these not to quit their tobacco use, but to reduce it. And that's an admirable goal. But those doing it for this reason should know that the reduction of a few cigarettes per day won't actually help them achieve any health-related goals or risk reductions that they hope to achieve by doing so. The science continues to show that even 1 cigarette per day increases the risk of heart disease. And to reduce carcinogen exposure by about half, the smoker has to reduce their smoking by 90%. So from a pack a day to 2 cigarettes per day. Most ENDS users do not achieve this lofty goal. Related to the above, many assume just a general harm reduction measure. And as we've seen for adult smokers with a habit, again, for adult smokers with an established conventional tobacco habit, this may be true. But for other populations, it's just not. ENDS have many known risks and present the opportunity for new risks to reveal themselves as we get more and more long-term users. Beliefs about nicotine in general are also wildly variable. Some people believe that nicotine itself is the carcinogen or the vector of disease. Others believe that nicotine is entirely safe. However, we know that in addition to being extremely addictive, nicotine causes lung and brain deformities in fetuses and stunts brain development as late as age 25. We know that the nicotine in first through third generation ENDS is free-base nicotine and is chemically identical to the nicotine found in other tobacco products. We know that for every 10 milligrams of nicotine a nursing mother consumes, 1 milligram is passed to the infant. Some researchers and watchdog groups have found nicotine even in e-juice vials labeled 0 milligrams nicotine or nicotine-free. And while nicotine alone is not yet causally linked to increased mortality, it is associated with cardiovascular conditions and to the development of cancers. So what is our bottom line here? Should anybody be recommending ENDS to their patients? Here's what we know. Tobacco smoke is the leading cause of premature mortality and morbidity. And we know that the safest alternative is nicotine abstinence. So for adults, using any of the 7 FDA-approved pharmacotherapies is their best second option. Many individuals, however, will find that using NRT isn't satisfactory enough. These aren't good replacements for smoking, and they're going to relapse. And for them, ENDS may be a more attractive option. But they should know ENDS offer known dangers and the possibility for us to discover even more. The bottom line is that users of all nicotine products, including ENDS and NRT, should be encouraged and assisted to become nicotine-free. So that's going to be the end of my prepared remarks. We do have some upcoming trainings. Those on the line, these are live trainings on the board here. You may be particularly interested in our motivational interviewing trainings that are coming up. And for all of these, you can head to our website listed there at the bottom of the slide for more registration information. And with that, I'm going to open up the lines for questions. As mentioned at the beginning, you can use the chat function to type in questions, or you can use the Q&A pop-up box, or you can raise your hand. And I think once you do that, Amy can unmute your line and you can ask your question directly. And I see that there are already some questions on the board, so I'm going to quickly review those. I see that there's a question here about 11% quit rates. Is that from all methods? And I'm not exactly sure what stat that is referring to. I think maybe from the all adult ends users wave 1 and wave 2 slide. And no, that 11% figure there, if I can just see it, that'd be great. It says half of Juul users at wave 1 had transitioned totally to cigarettes, as had 11% of former smokers. I think that might be the statistic that's being referred to, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. No, that is how many people who are using ends exclusively from that category had moved over to a cigarette-only habit. So it was quite the opposite of a quit attempt.
Jim, this is Amy. We have a question.
Date, I think the date for the training is on here. Oh, I don't actually know when the date for that is. I think my supervisor, Chad Morris, is on the line. Perhaps he can chime in with an actual date. Chad, if you can chat that in for us, or just open your line and let us know when the motivational interviewing training is, that'd be great.
Jim, we also have a question. You mentioned that MI is one of two.
Frank Oden says, Jim, you mentioned that MI is one of 2 recommended modalities. I did not mention the other one. The other one is cognitive behavioral therapy. We don't normally talk about it in our presentations very much because we have a pretty wide audience and not everybody can receive the adequate levels of training to adequately perform CBT-based exercises. However, almost anybody can learn motivational interviewing, so we tend to concentrate on that one. Oh, I had my audio off, sorry, thank you, Sean. And so Frank, Jimmy mentioned, CBT is the other one, and there's been some very cursory looking at dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT. For whatever reason, this has been underexplored, the use of DBT, but I think it looks pretty promising. We, of course, use DBT in other recovery efforts, and so it seems to me that that method would work in nicotine recovery as well. Amy, you were trying to address me. I'm sorry, I had my volume off.
Yes, you answered it.
Okay, good. Good. Anonymous says, what would be the best pieces of information to give to a young person that is vaping who didn't smoke cigarettes prior? Targeted information so that we can speak to a person who is young. Yeah, so this is a really difficult issue. Working with adolescents in general is always a problem. Because they're virtually aliens, as anybody who works with adolescents already knows. So the short answer is we always recommend, to the greatest extent possible, having the information delivered by other peers, that is other adolescents who've already gone through a recovery effort, and sharing whatever was useful for them. So much of what is of use is really almost, I don't want to say geographic in nature specifically, but very community oriented. When that's not an option, to approach authentically and definitely to hear from the adolescent what their knowledge base is first. So definitely starting with that really open posture where you're willing to listen, willing to hear what they're trying, what they're experiencing, and what they fear as they engage in a cessation effort. And then, making sure that you're available as a support rather than as a teacher or instructor. So I would start there. A lot of actually what I said here today in that key messages section, that final section, is actually inspired by engagement with adolescents in the sense that they're online. Adolescents are already in the Reddit forums, they're already on the user community forums, and they're hearing that we as professionals are liars, that we are in the tank for big tobacco, or we're in the tank for sort of a restrictivist, authoritarian governmental policy of banning things. And so we come into the adolescent relationship as somebody who's not necessarily trustworthy. And if we come in with the sensationalized headlines as weapons, they tend to do the opposite of what we intend, right? I mean, I think when I say that adolescents will balk at authority and do the opposite, I don't think that surprises anybody. And so that sort of tempered messaging is precisely aimed at, is also designed, or it was specifically designed for engagement with adolescents in that regard, which is to say that you want to be a trusted, knowledgeable resource who's willing to sort of balk the conventional wisdom to get to the truth. Encouraging recovery in adolescence really has to be, it's true for everybody, but it has to be really self-guided. And we have to understand that their trip-ups tend to be social in nature. It's also true of adults, but it's more so true for our adolescents, where up until recently, and things may change with the pod mods, up until recently, tobacco use in the adolescent populations was that it was sporadic. That is to say, they didn't smoke every day. They smoked at random days or it's on specific days, and they didn't smoke a lot. And so they didn't really have the physical cravings that NRT would address. And if we don't engage them, and back then when we weren't engaging them in an actual counseling session where we could help them map out their use, like physically, geographically, figure out when and where and with whom they smoked, and address those specific incidences, we were missing them, and we weren't getting good cessation successes out of those engagements. That's even more so true with ENDS. It's very definitely a social activity, and we have to address that social aspect. So that's where I would start. What would be the best piece of information to give to a young person is correct their misinformation, and then let them know that quitting is possible and ask them how they can best be helped to achieve that. Could you treat ENDS and NRT at the same, hopefully anonymous attendee that answers your question, but if not, please feel free to ask a clarifying question there. So the next anonymous attendee says, could you treat ENDS and NRT at the same time or overlapping as a slower quit attempt if they are a heavy cigarette smoker? The short answer here is yes. I would say that anybody who is willing to use nicotine replacement therapy should be encouraged to make that transition exclusively to NRT. It may be a little faster than you might otherwise want to do that. Obviously, that needs to be patient directed, but if somebody's willing to use NRT at all, I would say that getting them over there would be a higher concern for me. On putting them together, if the risk there is can they get too much nicotine, the general answer is no. It's very, very, very hard to overdose on nicotine if you are an average-sized adult. I think back on that slide, I have that a toddler, somebody who weighs something like 30 or 40 pounds, would still have to take in between 90 and 180 cigarettes worth of nicotine just to have a 50% chance of fatality. An adult would be 4, 5, 6 times that amount. And there's a threshold where nicotine stops being enjoyable and tilts into sort of that overexposure category, where the early signs are headache, nausea, dizziness, all these really uncomfortable bits. And so a patient is really knowledgeable about their own bodies and can say, like, this is too much nicotine. I'm getting too much. And they won't risk actual harm so much as they will very quickly titrate down to a more adequate level. So you can do it. I would say that it's probably going to be harder to make that balancing act, because what you want to do is sort of control that nicotine dose, have a good knowledge of how much nicotine they're getting so that you can actively and regularly step down that nicotine exposure until they get to about 10 milligrams per day, in which case then they're ready to step off of nicotine altogether. That's the sort of general consensus of when the withdrawal and cravings aren't so insurmountable, is right around 3 to 5 cigarettes per day, which would be between, roughly about 6 and 10 milligrams of nicotine per day. And if they're sort of using both ad libitum, then it's going to be harder to know when they've hit that stepping off level. So possible, yes, but you want to make sure that you're quantifying how much nicotine so we can make those adjustments along the way. Smokers often, and again, anonymous attendee, I hope I answered your question there, but if not, please feel free to type in a different one. Smokers often cite financial reasons for quitting. Do you know general costs for people maintaining an ENDS habit? This is really geographical. The manufacturers are pretty smart. They tend to try to make the ENDS pricing roughly equivalent to your local cigarette pricing. And though I'm not going to say that they're specifically tied to popular brands, like I don't know that it's that intentional, but that's just sort of how the economics tends to work out. And so what you'll see often is the startup kits will be pretty heavily discounted. So that's to get people in the door. And then after that, the price per nicotine hit is roughly equivalent to cigarettes. So you assume that a person is getting between 1 and 2 milligrams per cigarette per day. So whatever their cost of maintaining their particular habit should be addressed or tend to be thought of in terms of their nicotine per hit. Okay, so if there are 20, make that more concrete. If they're a pack a day cigarette smoker, they're paying about $6 for the pack. Let's just say that's sort of the national average, and it's between 20 and 40 milligrams of nicotine. Right. So then to get 20 to 40 milligrams of nicotine from an e-cig, they'd be paying roughly $6. They're not necessarily the difference is that just like with NRT, when they pay for their cigarettes or when they pay for their nicotine is altered by the quantities. So a single pod in a Juul, for example, contains about 40 milligrams of accessible nicotine. Or actually it's 40 milligrams of nicotine, of which between 20 and 30 milligrams is bioavailable. And so, how do I say that? So you don't normally buy one pod at a time. You buy them in packs. So they're going to pay slightly more than $6 at a time. But if you average it out per day, then they would be roughly equivalent over some time horizon. Which is all to say, one of our obstacles here is that nicotine replacement therapy follows that same pattern. The gum and the lozenge are actually roughly equivalent in terms of price per nicotine milligram as cigarettes are. But with nicotine replacement therapy, you're buying 30 days at once. And so coming up with $180, $200 once a month is much harder than coming up with $6 every day, at least psychologically harder. It's obviously the same job, but overcoming that financial planning hurdle is actually a potential secondary intervention you might want to implement alongside of a more direct cessation recovery intervention. If that makes sense, Frank. If not, again, by all means, ask a second question. So we still have about 7 minutes for more questions. Thank you for those who have asked, and I hope I'm answering them appropriately. Sometimes it's hard to answer on the spot when I'm just staring at a weird computer screen. I can't see your faces to see if I've answered your question. One thing I did want to readdress and make sure that there's actually a couple things. Number one is this is a really nuanced problem, and it's politically fraught. People want to hear that ends are definitely good or they're definitely bad. They definitely should recommend them, and they definitely shouldn't. And to really truly answer the question of whether you should definitely be recommending these products or not, you have to be able to know the future. If you knew, for example, that the person sitting in front of you would definitely relapse to cigarettes if you move them to NRT, then I think it's pretty clear that ENDS is a better option for them. The problem is, of course, we don't know for whom relapse is going to materialize and for whom it's not. I mean, all things considered, if we knew exactly about 5% of folks who try to quit cold turkey will be successful at that method. And if we knew exactly who those 5% were, we could recommend going cold turkey for them, but we don't. And because we don't want to recommend cold turkey at all, because the withdrawal is really unpleasant, and it impacts family life, and it impacts people's ability to get to and from work, and it undermines their productivity and makes them bad parents. And there's all these reasons why quitting cigarettes is hard and unpleasant. And when those quit attempts are hit a certain level, we call it a bad quit. And a bad quit experience will delay the next quit attempt, the one that might actually be successful. As a result, we've always said that it's a best practice that we should just recommend NRT to everybody. And for some of those people, they're not going to quote unquote need it, but the only way to know that is to have forecasted their future. And we don't have that crystal ball. But we do know that when people use NRT, and especially if they compound their NRT with counseling, that's a pretty intensive effort, but we get about 30 to 35% quits out of that. And that's where we want to go. And our problem with ENDS is very similar. We want people off NRT, we want people off ENDS, but we mostly want them off of smoking. And I want them to use whatever method they think is going to give them the confidence they need to make that choice. But if they do make the ENDS, I think that they do need to have their risk assessment calibrated. They need to know it's not the safest option for them, and we want to move them to the safest option at the most reasonable pace for them. The other thing I want to make clear is that there's a very big difference right now between adult use and youth and young adult use. Up to age 25, nicotine continues to impact the brain. It diminishes the brain's ability to develop its executive functions, which means it diminishes future decisions. And it primes the brain for future addictions as well, by the same addiction methods that any addiction primes the brain. That is, it starts creating additional receptors and diminishing their ability to receive messages. And so people want more and more and more of certain drugs to do things like activate their dopamine production. And so the younger a person is, the more impactful that particular path becomes, or that exposure becomes. And so I think it's really clear, and again, I'm not alone here, the National Academies agreed, CDC agrees, for adults with a smoking habit, that double set of adults and smoking habit, ends represent a harm reduction path. Not necessarily the best path, but a path. For youth, it just isn't. And we don't want youth using at all. We don't want them to entertain the idea of using ENDS as a cessation device, and with good reason. We don't know a lot about ENDS, but what we do know is that NRT has been tested in audiences younger than 18, and it doesn't work yet. We have no evidence that it works. We have some speculation that it may in the future, but it doesn't now. And if NRT doesn't work, then for the same reasons that NRT doesn't work, ENDS are unlikely to work either. So for youth, ENDS are not a cessation pathway that we want to entertain, at least for now. I doubt we'll ever add that to the regimen, but for now, we definitely don't. So we still have about, looks like some other questions have come in here. As soon as I find my mouse, I'll answer them. How can you involve family members into helping people quit when says, how can you involve family members into helping people quit when most smokers try to quit by themselves? That's a great question. And so, when we recommend people to do the 5 A's or the 2 A's and an R, the first A is ask. We're doing a basic screening. And we're not just screening, do you use tobacco? We actually want people to say, do you use tobacco, or do you live or work in an environment where you're exposed to tobacco? And that is a slightly different strategy. Well, we do definitely want to, we can address secondhand smoke exposure or secondhand vape exposure separately. And, you ask for willingness. Do you think your spouse or partner or roommates would be willing to help you out in this regard? Or, you can actually ask the patient for permission to bring the spouse, partner, or roommates into the session, or whatever you need to do, or whatever your environment is when. And try to promote that quit attempt separately for that other person, whoever that live-in partner is. I'll give you a more concrete example. We do this all the time in the pediatric environment. We bill against the child when we do a quit attempt with the parent, because we're actually working on the patient's health, right, by getting the parent to quit. But that is sort of the method. We do it exactly the same way as we do if we have direct contact. We do it exactly the same with the parent as we do with the child, which is to start the whole process. Ask about exposure, ask about their willingness, provide them the tools they need. With family members, ideally, this is true of addiction recoveries and other mental health supports, actually just utilizing a family therapeutic environment where the couple is seen together is always a great option. We also see this in medication adherence, asking the partner to say, like, can you help them count their pills every day? Can you be a reminder system for our patient? They're going to listen to you better than they listen to their cell phones, right? So how is harder because it's sort of limited by your protocols and what you're able to do professionally. But whether or not you should is absolutely, it's proven a great support in all recovery efforts. Can you explain one more time? I'm going to do this. This will be the last question. I know we're a little over time, so I won't begrudge anybody who has to sign off, but I do want to get to this one. Can you explain one more time why ENDS is safer for adults with a cigarette smoking habit? Cigarettes kill 480,000 people a year. They're the most deadly substance that we ever encounter recreationally. Tobacco itself contains about 4,000 chemicals, of which several are known carcinogens. Tobacco smoke that is inhaled contains about 7,000 chemicals, over a dozen of which are known carcinogens. When we talk about cigarette-related illnesses or tobacco-related illnesses, we are primarily talking about two: heart disease and lung cancer. And the vectors of those diseases, or the actual chemical process, the biological processes, the biochemical processes that cause those diseases, are pretty well mapped out. I mean, science is science, and there's always room for improvement, but we generally have a good understanding of how atherosclerosis is developed, or how oxidative stress develops by exposure to things like carbon monoxide, right? Those things are largely absent from ENDS, right? So, for example, the carbon monoxide is a byproduct of combustion. There's no combustion in an electronic nicotine delivery system. So suddenly we've reduced the amount of damage that can be done oxidatively through the introduction of carbon monoxide. And that's an important improvement, right? So it sort of starts there. Like, if you say that cigarettes are the most deadly product, it's a pretty low bar to say that anything is going to be more dangerous than that, or it's a high bar to say it's going to be more dangerous, a low bar to say it's less dangerous than that. But also, when we map out all the different diseases and all the different processes, the etiologies of these diseases from the first puff through the development of the disease, most of those processes are interrupted by the introduction of the ENDS. They don't exist. So I don't know, anonymous attendee, if that kind of gets you to where you want, then I'm happy to answer that question offline as well. Yeah, so again, one more and then I'll go. Some say Juul, the Juul pod equals 1 pack of cigs. Others say it's equal to 2 packs. It's 40 milligrams of the actual nicotine in the pod, of which not all of it's going to be bioavailable. So if anybody's saying it's 2 packs, it's because the average cigarette contains 1 to 2 milligrams of bioavailable nicotine. It actually contains 8 to 9 milligrams of nicotine. So a pack of cigarettes contains something on the order of 180 milligrams of nicotine. But the smoker can only get between 20 and 40 of those. So that 40 number is telling you, okay, so there's 40 in both of the figures, right? A person may be getting 40 milligrams of nicotine from a pack of cigarettes. There's 40 milligrams of nicotine available in a pod, or existent in a pod. The problem is, this is where 2 packs becomes problematic, right? If the person gets 20 milligrams from a pack, because that's the range, 20 to 40. If a person is a 20 milligram person, then you might say, well, there's the equivalent of 2 packs in a pod because there's 40 milligrams in the pod. But most of that's not going to be bioavailable. Normally, we're operating on the order of 25, 30%. You could go up as high as maybe 50 or 60% with these nicotine salt formulations. But the bottom line is that I would say a pack is probably roughly the right equivalent. That's harder to determine, and I'm waiting for that science to roll in. Okay, hopefully I answered that one. And we're 4 minutes past time. Thank you for those of you who sticked around. The webinar will be recorded. It will be available on our website. If you don't see it in the next week, then reach out to us and we'll tell you where it is and when you'll be able to have it. Thank you all very, very much.